There we go. We'll also have some slides talking about how we determine what work time is versus what work time isn't. So what we include in our calculation of work time. Then we're going to get into some calculations. And we're going to start really talking about overtime and how to calculate overtime. Seems like it would be simple, but there are some complications to it. There are some challenges that can present themselves. So let's first start talking about exempt versus non-exempt and what we mean by that. A lot of, if you're familiar at all with the terms exempt or non-exempt employees, a lot of times we will interchange exempt with salaried, and that's what we'll think of exempt employees as, that they're on a salary rather than being paid on an hourly basis, but that's not always the case. We do have individuals, well, you can have exempt employees that are paid on an hourly basis. You can have non-exempt employees that are paid on a salaried basis. The important thing is that that person, whether they're paid on a salary basis or an hourly basis, making sure that we are meeting the requirements based on their classification of whether they're exempt, meaning exempt from the overtime and minimum wage provisions of the FLSA. That's what that exempt means. It means that the employee is not subject to not entitled to overtime for hours over 40 hours a week, and they're not entitled to minimum wage based on that hourly minimum wage amount. Now, you'll see when we start talking about this, there is a minimum wage for exempt individuals, but it's not based on a per hour rate. For exempt employees, so they have no overtime. Yes, overtime. No hourly minimum wage. Yes, hourly minimum wage. So that's at $7.25 an hour that they are required to be paid. Exempt employees do have a weekly salary, weekly minimum wage that they have to be paid. And we'll go, I guess this slide goes through it. That weekly minimum wage is $684 per week. That comes out to $35,000, I can't remember the exact numbers, on an annual basis, times $35,568 on an annual basis that they are paid. So who are the exempt employees? They are individuals who fit one of these classifications. And it's based on the type of work they do, the responsibilities that they have, and whether or not they supervise other individuals. So executives, administrators, professionals, we'll go into some more detail in the next slide on what the definitions are of these. Business owners, highly compensated employees, computer professionals, creative professionals, and outside salespeople are, if the employee fits one of those classifications, then they would be classified as exempt from that minimum wage, hourly minimum wage, and overtime provisions of the FLSA. They still have to be paid at least $684 a week for their salaries. The only pay period during which they may be paid less than the $684 is the very first pay period. Is the very first pay period that they start working. So, like if the work week is Monday through Friday and they start working on Wednesday, they can be paid a proportion of that $684. So they can prorate at that first pay period, Also the last pay period. So if they stop working, are terminated or quit, say on the Monday, and the work week goes through Friday, then they can be paid just that for the 1 day of work at $684. But for every other pay period, they have to be paid at least this minimum of $684 a week. Now, oftentimes these individuals are actually paid quite a bit more than that. You'll see when we go through the different types of professions that we're talking about. Usually these are more highly compensated types of positions. Individuals who are considered, we also call these white collar workers. That's this kind of old terminology, but white collar workers, and think, people who would show up in suits and wearing white shirts to their job, as opposed to blue collar workers. So those individuals, I guess, who would not be wearing suits and not be wearing those white shirts to their jobs. Like I said, it's very old terminology. Blue collar workers are manual workers. They are always entitled to overtime pay. So there's a certain classification of workers here that even if they would sort of meet the qualifications of exempt, they're not. They're going to be entitled to overtime pay. And those are police officers, EMTs, firefighters, paramedics, and licensed practical nurses. So even if they're on a salary, they're still entitled to that overtime pay for hours that are worked over 40 hours in a week. And oftentimes, in those professions, especially like police officers and EMTs, they count on that overtime pay. Like they want to get into overtime during their pay periods. So this goes into a little bit more detail here about these different professions. So executives. What is an executive? So if the primary duty is managing operations, managing whatever department it might be, they supervise 2 or more employees, and they have the authority to hire, fire, or promote those employees, then they're classified as an executive, and they would be in an exempt position. Administrative. Primary duty is office work, some type of office work. We usually think of like administrative, professional, secretarial types of duties. Regularly uses discretion and independent judgment. So a bookkeeper would fall under this category as well. So a bookkeeper would perform office work, and they regularly use their discretion and independent judgment as far as how they're going to complete their work. It requires some degree of skill. They can be classified as exempt employees. Professionals. If the work requires advanced knowledge, and the knowledge is acquired by prolonged course of instruction. Usually we'll think of CPAs, attorneys, architects, doctors, those types of positions would fall under the professional category. Business owners. So these are individuals who they own the business. If they own at least 20% of the business, 20% of the equity in the business, and they actively manage the business operations, then they're considered to be exempt if they're also employees. Now, oftentimes owners are not employees. They fall under some different category. They may be self-employed, or they just may not be considered employees and have the protections of an employer. But if they are considered to be employees, then if they own at least 20% of the equity and they actively manage, they would be considered exempt employees of that business. Highly compensated is kind of, if you earn more than $107,432 a year, you're probably, you're going to be outside of this minimum wage anyway, but you don't have to be paid overtime if you're a highly compensated employee, if it's non-manual work, and you regularly perform one of the exempt duties of an executive, administrative, or professional. So, again, think highly compensated CPA in a CPA firm. You'd fall under the professional anyway, but if you're making more than that, then again, you're considered to be an exempt employee. Computer professionals have their own category. The duties would consist of system analysis techniques, design of computer systems or programs. So anybody in computer programming or, data analysis, that sort of thing, any computer professional would automatically, because of the nature of their work, fall under the exempt category. Creative professionals, so anybody whose job requires invention, imagination, originality, or talent in an artistic or a creative endeavor. Musicians, actors, painters, that sort of thing, they would automatically be considered exempt. Outside salespeople as well, as opposed to inside salespeople. There's a difference here. So outside salespeople, their primary duty is to make sales or obtain orders for either services or use of facilities or for products. They are regularly away from the employer's place of business. So they don't sit at their desk in the office and make phone calls to make their sales. Think, if you ever watch The Office and Jim Halpern making, those guys are inside salespeople because they're sitting at a desk in there making their sales. But these are people who are outside of the office, meeting with clients and making those sales. And there's no salary test for this. So there's actually they're exempt from this $684. Usually they're based on a commission, like 100% commission, and chances are, if they're good at their job, they're going to be making a lot more than that anyway. So if an individual falls into one of these categories, then they can be classified as exempt from the minimum wage and overtime provisions of the FLSA. Okay. Questions about that? It's important because, like I said, a lot of people confuse if you're salaried, if you're exempt, they'll think you're automatically salaried. And that's not necessarily the case. You can fall under one of these categories. As long as you're making the $684 a week, they can still pay you on an hourly basis. They can still pay you overtime as well. When I was working at one of the CPA firms that I worked at, I obviously fell under the professional classification, but I was paid on an hourly basis. So I got, which was actually really nice during tax season because I worked an awful lot of overtime during that time of the year. So even though I met that, because it's more generous, right? It's a more generous situation for them to pay me that overtime, and I met all of the, met the requirements of an exempt employee anyway. But these individuals, again, they're not entitled to overtime pay, and they're not entitled to that minimum hourly wage. Okay. Now, a couple other things we want to talk about. Any questions about exempt versus non-exempt? Is that clear between the two? Okay. Because we are going to be talking about individuals that are salaried and considered to be exempt, we're going to be talking about individuals who are salaried, but they are non-exempt, and we have to calculate, for purposes of calculating their overtime, what is their rate of pay. If somebody's making $50,000 a year, and they worked 42 hours during the week, but they're entitled to overtime pay for those 2 hours of overtime, how do we calculate what that hourly rate is in order to then calculate what the overtime is for that individual? So that's why it's important for us to know the distinction between these two. A couple other things about the FLSA that we need to mention. So, and I had sort of in passing mentioned this before, that the FLSA does now, and this is an amended part of the FLSA, requires that men and women that are performing the same job, they have the same education, they have the same experience, are paid the same amount. So gender cannot be the distinguishing factor in salaries. You can still pay people different rates based on, seniority, based on merit. So you can give bonuses to those who are better performers than others, or you can pay them a higher rate because they've done particularly well. And you can't, any payment plan that measures earnings by quantity or quality of production is perfectly fine. You don't have to take gender into consideration there, but any other factor other than what their gender is can be taken into account to determine what their rate of pay is. It's just you can't base it solely on what their gender is. Couple other things we need to talk about. So as I had mentioned, there are 4 main provisions of the FLSA. We've got the overtime requirements, overtime pay requirements, minimum wage requirements, we have record-keeping requirements, and we have child labor restrictions within this within the FLSA. So whether or not somebody falls under the protection for child labor purposes depends on how old they are. So what is a child considered to be? A child is, for the purposes of the FLSA, a child is someone who is under the age of 18 years. So for employees that are 16 and 17, there's no restriction on the number of hours that they can work. They still have to be paid overtime if they work over 40 hours in the week. They may or may not, if they're getting that training wage, they may make the $7.25 an hour, they may make that lower training wage, but they still have the minimum wage requirements that have to be met, but there's no limitation on the number of hours that they can work. Now, it has to be in non-hazardous jobs. 16 and 17-year-olds cannot work in positions in hazardous positions, whether it's through machinery or chemicals or things of that nature. So there are restrictions as far as what occupations they can.
Are minors allowed to own their own business?
Sure.
Like that law doesn't, it excludes that?
Yeah, because they're not employees, are they?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Nope, that's a great question. No, absolutely. Yes, they're able to own their own business, and a lot of, you're probably thinking maybe like lawn mowing, lawn care. There are a lot of teenagers that will do that kind of thing. You'd consider the lawnmower to be maybe a hazardous condition. But that is fine. They can do that. Yep. Now, 14 and 15-year-olds, I was talking with the last class about this. I don't know if there are any other places aside from Fairway where 14 or 15-year-olds can get jobs. There might be. In my day, it was a paper route. People still actually read the paper, a physical paper, during those times. But 14 and 15-year-olds are limited to certain areas of employment. They can only work in retail, food service, and gasoline service. And there are limitations on the hours that they can work. I'm going to pull this up because I can never remember this off the top of my head, what those hours are. Let's see. So they have to, if you are 14 or 15, all work has to be performed outside of school hours. So it cannot interfere with their schooling. They have a maximum 3-hour day, an 18-hour week when school is in session. So during the school year, they're limited to that. And all work has to be performed between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. They can work until 9 p.m. though during the summer hours. So that, again, is just for 14 and 15-year-olds. That does not apply to 16 and 17-year-olds. And these are non-farm types of job, non-agricultural occupations. So for agricultural occupations, generally speaking, kids under the age of 12 are prohibited from working in those occupations. However, there are some there are some exceptions to that. Kids that are 10 and 11-year-olds can work as hand harvest laborers outside of school hours between June 1st and October 15th. What's happening in Iowa? Oh, it's about to happen right now. Going to start, what's that? Harvest, right. What do they do before the harvest? Has anybody ever worked in corn detasseling? Or known kids that would work in corn detasseling? This is something where they take the tassels off of the corn before they harvest it. Now, back in my day, I would have friends that would do this, and they would do it as part of their summer job. They didn't get paid very much, and it was hot, sweaty, dirty work, and there are a lot of bugs in cornfields, if you've ever been in a cornfield. But it's that type of work. hand harvesting. So they are 10 and 11-year-olds are able to do that, but only between those dates during the year. And there's very strict limitations. They can't be around dangerous machinery and that sort of thing. It's a little, there's a lot of chemicals out there too. I'd be kind of hesitant to let my 10 or 11-year-old go out there, but it does give them the opportunity to get some work experience. If so, an employer that does have children on their labor force, they have to have a certificate of age showing that the minor has reached whatever minimum wage for that particular profession. So that has to be on file. And there's some really very strict rules with regard to like violations. If somebody violates child labor laws, the business can get themselves into a lot of trouble criminally and civilly with that. Oops. So speaking of getting themselves into trouble, let me try and get this back to where it was. There we go. Speaking of businesses getting themselves into trouble, so wage theft. Now, wage theft is any time that an employer takes an employee's wages, and that may be, not paying them for work that they're owed or for amounts that they're owed. It could be, deducting amounts from their pay that they shouldn't be deducting. Employees do have recourse through the court system when the employer does not pay them, or if they've been misclassified. Now that misclassification could be that they should be a non-exempt employee and entitled to overtime, but they were classified as an exempt employee instead, or if they misclassify them as an independent contractor when they should have been classified as an employee. There's 2 years to sue for any pay mistakes, 3 years to sue for willful mistakes. So there's a difference between whether it was intentional or not, and the U.S. government can bring criminal and civil charges as well against employers who violate the FLSA. So the employee has recourse and the government has recourse. So some types of wage theft you might think of, if an individual worked 42 hours during the week and they were entitled to overtime pay for those 2 extra hours that they worked and they were not paid at an overtime rate. That is wage theft. Employers who mandate an employee clock out, but then they can't leave. They still have a mandate that they do work. So they clock out, but they still have to clean up their excuse me, their workstation or their area. They cannot do that. That is wage theft. Employees are entitled to that pay for all hours worked, even if it's the employee's fault that they didn't get that work done. So if an employee doesn't, during their shift doesn't complete all of their work, that does not give the employer the right to clock them out, but still make them do that work. Now, there could certainly be consequences for the employee if they're not doing their work within their shift, and that's what they're expected to do. They could still be terminated, or other types of punishments could ensue. But the employer has to pay them for that time. Let's see, and penalties, as well as those like criminal and civil suits can ensue. Some things that the FLSA does not cover, and we've talked about a little bit of this. Employees are not entitled to extra pay for holiday or weekend work. Employers may decide that they want to give extra pay for that. They may tell employees or have a policy where they pay double time or time and a half if you work on a holiday or work on a weekend. That's fine. Employers can always be more generous than the FLSA if they choose to. They just cannot be less generous. So any extra pay is not mandated. Pay for holidays. So, if you get time off for a holiday, you get New Year's Day off, the employer doesn't have to pay you for that. A lot of employers do provide paid holidays, but that's not mandated. Vacation time, severance time, none of that is mandated by law. That's just decided on an employer by employer basis. There's no limit on the number of hours that an employee can be mandated to work as long as that employee is 16 years or older. So if the employer says you've got to work 80 hours this week, you've got to work 80 hours that week. Now, you're probably entitled to overtime pay for the hours over 40, but there's no requirement that employees have to be allowed or can't be made to work overtime. They don't have to give holidays off. They don't have to grant vacation time. They don't have to grant sick leave. So now, again, there could be certain jurisdictions, cities, states, where those are mandated, but at the federal level, as far as the FLSA is concerned, there is no requirement that those items be covered by the FLSA or by employers per the FLSA. Any questions right now?